Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on national television about India's foreign policy, India's engagement with important countries and groupings around the world, and how India through a proactive foreign policy is shaping a better world order. Viewers, in this episode we are looking at a very important pillar of India's foreign policy. This is its Act East policy. The Act East policy is a strategy to enhance greater economic and strategic cooperation with countries in Southeast Asia, in Northeast Asia, in Oceania, and essentially to connect India with its old historical linkages across this region, and to enmesh India into rule making and rule creation in this region, so that we have a prosperous and secure future for all of us. And to discuss the Act East policy, I have a very special guest in the studio. Let me introduce you to Ambassador Deepa Gopalan Wadhwa. Ambassador Wadhwa was India's ambassador to Japan and to the Marshall Islands, and also to Sweden and Qatar. Has spent a long time in the Indian Foreign Service, distinguished diplomat who has served the country with great honor. Ambassador Wadhwa, Act East policy, we have renamed it from what used to be called Look East policy in 2014, and in the Narendra Modi era there has been a lot of emphasis on this pan regional approach, so that there is an integrated foreign policy. Is not just a one on one. We have very strong bilaterals in this region, but it should all add up to something big, which is this enhanced economic and strategic ties, so that our power and influence also grows. So your assessment of the Act East policy in the last 8 years, how much have we achieved, and what needs to be done?
First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Chaulia. Very happy to be on this show on Indian diplomacy. Now, to talk about the transition from the Look East policy to the Act East policy, as you said very correctly, the East, as we described it earlier, is very much part of our extended neighborhood.
Right.
And therefore, in 1992, when we were opening our economy, we looked at this engagement, which was so long. It has been historical, civilizational, even political,
right,
during the time that both of us were under colonial rule, to expand this and give it more economic content. And this Look East policy did us very well, I must say, for very many years. We went from a sectoral partner to a full dialogue partner to a summit level partner. Then we established a strategic partnership and so on. So, it's been a progress that did very well. But I think in 2014 at the Naypyidaw, the East Asia Summit, Prime Minister Modi decided that it needed more dynamism.
Right.
And therefore, he renamed it the Act East policy. And when you talk about the Act East policy, he talks about 4 pillars of it. So he talks about it as culture, commerce, connectivity, and capacity building. But what's the difference between the two? I think people should know. The Look East policy really was very ASEAN focused. But in the Act East policy, the changes were that the remit was expanded.
We've got even bigger.
That is right. So the remit was expanded to include East Asia to begin with. So you have Japan, Korea. Then Oceania, so therefore Australia, the Pacific Island states, and very importantly, I think it also had an element of deepening the strategic connect. That was already there, but deepening it and
more defense and more military.
Yeah, more connectivity. Connectivity is strategic too.
Yeah.
Security is strategic too, and
yeah,
therefore to give it more strategic content. And one very interesting and important element, and that was the development of the northeast of India, the northeast region of India. And this became very pivotal for our Act East policy, because I think development is really prosperity and connectivity is prosperity. So this had new elements, and we were also, I think, what had happened since the time of the Look East to the Act East policy, India had become a major economic power. Our relations with all the countries in the region had changed, and therefore we needed new parameters and to look at a new policy.
No, so the domestic buy-in for a foreign policy has been a very central element of the Narendra Modi era. Actually, in many ways he has made foreign policy so relevant to India's own developmental and security needs, and this element of the northeast that you are mentioning is especially important because it is the gateway to the Southeast Asia, to Myanmar and beyond, and we have been wanting to reopen the long lost roads and transportation corridors and the connectivity that you are mentioning. So, viewers, on this there is very interesting comments by our External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar, where he is talking about the northeast of India and how it needs to further integrate with extended neighborhood of Southeast Asia, and how Japan is playing an important role in facilitating these linkages. Let us listen in and continue the discussion.
Think what happens if land connectivity through Myanmar and a sea connectivity through Bangladesh become viable. On a commercial scale, a world all the way to Vietnam and Philippines, from Haiphong to Hazira and from Manila to Mundra will open up, creating an east-west lateral with sweeping consequences for the continent. It would not only build on the partnerships that we have with the ASEAN and Japan, but would actually make a difference to the Indo-Pacific economic framework that is now in the making. It is definitely within our ability to overcome geography and rewrite near history, if only we can get the politics and the economics right. Given the prioritization of the Northeast by the Modi government, it is only obvious that we should work with our most trusted global partners. In 2017, we launched the India-Japan Act East Forum as a platform to bring together all stakeholders and coordinate planning and implementation of projects being undertaken with Japanese assistance. These cover projects in domains as diverse as road and highway connectivity, renewable energy, forest management, urban amenities, and strengthening healthcare systems. During Prime Minister Kishida's visit to India just this March for the annual summit, the two Prime Ministers launched an initiative for sustainable development of northeastern region of India as an overarching framework for enhancing cooperation in new areas such as healthcare, business-to-business ties, disaster management, and skill development.
Viewers, External Affairs Minister of India talking about the need to rewrite history and overcome geography. Ambassador Wadhwa, this is of course a grand project, and the connectivity that he is talking about is really at the heart of this, and the land connectivity, the inland waterways, the oceanic transportation networks, those we used to have them in pre-colonial times, but since have been constricted by accidents of history and world wars and divisions, cold wars and such things. But now through Act East policy, we are trying to reinvigorate those linkages, and the land transportation, we have been working on multiple projects. Some of them have been delayed, haven't gotten through, but overall I think if you include Bangladesh also, which is the beginning of our Act East policy in many ways, although it is part of South Asia, you see that we are opening lots of new corridors and connections and enabling freer movement of goods and people, and this is of course at the heart of the Act East policy. So your thoughts on the whole connectivity agenda of the Act East policy?
Yes, as Foreign Minister Dr. Jaishankar just said, it is important to connect, of course, the Northeast with the rest of India and the Northeast with the ASEAN.
Yes.
And also, as you mentioned, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan. So, that there is, that breeds a sort of prosperity over there, and connectivity is really connected so closely to prosperity. But, connectivity is not only connectivity to do with roads and infrastructure. Yes, very important, but it's also power grids, it's energy lines, it is people to people contacts, it's experiences. And in fact, I was there at that Nadi conference where External Affairs Minister Jaishankar was speaking, and we had delegates from all over the region who were there, including all the ASEAN ambassadors. So the development of the Northeast is extremely important to the rest of India, and I think certainly also important for our relationships with all our neighbors, including our our immediate neighbors with whom we have a neighborhood first policy, and there's kind of an overlap between the Act East policy and the neighborhood first policy.
Absolutely.
And you can see it when you go there. I mean, the kind of infrastructure, whether it is as you said, waterways or roadways, or just and these very ambitious projects that we have through Myanmar connecting to ASEAN. You have the India, Myanmar, Thailand trilateral highway. You have the Kaladan multimodal transport project. There are several projects there. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, yes, because of several reasons, including what is happening in Myanmar right now, they have been delayed. But when they are realized, I think they're going to make such a difference. I recall that Dr. Jaishankar also said at the same speech that we'd be able to connect finally Haiphong to Hazira.
Correct.
That you would have an east-west highway connectivity across India from one end to the other, and with that would come so much more prosperity.
That's a big vision, ma'am. And on the Japanese role in particular, they have become very active in Southeast Asia. Not just in the northeast of India, right? So the fact that they are doing so many development projects and infrastructure projects across this whole east-west arc makes them, I think, the main dynamo, external dynamo powering our Act East policy. You have been ambassador to Japan, and I'm sure you have coordinated these things with them in places like Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and so many other countries. Japan, India jointly are doing works, public works and such things. So this of course makes the Act East policy, there is a congruence between the Japanese activism in their own foreign policy, especially in the Shinzo Abe period, and our Act East, right. So I think that meeting of grounds between India and Japan has been very critical to take this forward.
Indeed, so it has been. So Japan of course has been in the forefront of this, what is called FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific. That was Shinzo Abe's really idea to the world, which we also have adopted with our own modifications, as has the ASEAN and several other countries, as you know, even in Europe. And you have our Act East policy, which in some way is kind of the eastern flank and predates actually our own vision of the Indo-Pacific. So there is a lot of overlap, and you're quite right. With Japan, besides the bilateral relationship having really intensified across the board, what we are also looking at is both of us working together in third countries, and you mentioned Bangladesh, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and perhaps beyond. I think that is really the way forward. That both of us can bring in our own relative strengths and be able to work in third countries, and in Africa too, of course, we've mentioned it. And as far as Japan is concerned, with the ASEAN, Japan went into the ASEAN about the 1980s. They went in with ODA. They built that fantastic infrastructure that you find in the ASEAN, among the ASEAN countries, trade, investment. It became a hub for their manufacturing. In fact, even today, it's a very important part of their global supply chains.
Right.
So the ASEAN is extremely important to Japan. And the whole thing is, how do we become part of the supply chains? And so there's Japan, ASEAN, India. It's also part of our Act East policy. I think the connection in terms of the economic connect that there could be between us.
On the supply chains, Ambassador Wadhwa, Dr. Jaishankar has been talking about decentralized globalization, and that our Act East policy and our ASEAN-centric outlook and all these things help propel this phenomenon. And he is of course referring to the excessive concentration of production and investment in China, in mainland China, which has led to a lot of vulnerabilities for countries in the region. So how potent is India as a player? I mean, people often say that don't compare India and China, because China is a much bigger trading country, much more industrialized and manufacturing base than India is. But still, our trade volumes are going up. With ASEAN, it almost touched $90 billion.
Almost
$100 billion.
Right. Yeah.
And that's significant. And even with Japan, with South Korea, which has a southbound policy which aims at India in particular, all these are coming together. With Australia also, now we have crossed $30 billion overall trade. So you see that the volumes are rising, and also investments are coming in from ASEAN countries. Like Singapore is of course the number one, but we have strong growing trading ties with Indonesia, with Vietnam, with Malaysia. So if you take the full picture, economically we seem to be progressively, maybe slowly, but progressively becoming a bigger player in the region, and that is of course what the players in the region want, right? They want India to be there so that they have an alternative, so that they have a so-called China plus one, you know, another option. So in that sense, as India grows, our exports are also rising lately. I think the potential for that is tremendous. We have now signed even with Australia a free trade agreement. That was one of the missing pieces. So although we stayed out of the regional comprehensive economic partnership agreement, and some people were disappointed about it in the region, the point is, if you look at it, almost all the RCEP members except China, now we have FTAs with them. And that seems to be the way forward, because India does not want to be left out of the economic picture, because otherwise the regional architecture is incomplete.
It's quite right. I mean, we have FTAs with almost every country, as you mentioned. The ASEAN itself, we do have an FTA with ASEAN. Some of these FTAs require upgradation, as we're looking at with, say, South Korea. With Japan, we have a CEPA. Now, as you mentioned, Australia. So yes, you see, the fact is that India, at the end of the day, is, you know, 1/5 of the global population. We're a huge market. What brings FDI into India? What brings foreign interests to look at India in terms of whether trade or investment or FIIs? It's just the size of our market. And this is just going to grow. So, you know, we are going to grow economically. Of course, we have a lot of domestic policies, which is making sure that we can also become a manufacturing hub and be part of these global supply chains. Because you see, it's quite right, because what happened was, and I heard Dr. Jaishankar mention it, that starting from the 2008 crisis, and then of course the COVID crisis, made us realize that, you know, you've got to diversify these global supply chains. They can't be concentrated in one particular region, and that we have a role to play. And how do we become part of that? It's not very easy to do, as you know, that after, you know, after the COVID pandemic, Japan tried to reshore its industries and take them back, and, you know, set up a $2 billion fund, but very few wanted to leave China. But there is place, you talk about Japan plus, you know, China plus. But I think, you know, countries are still looking at Southeast Asia.
Yes.
And it's very important now with our PLI schemes and so on to make sure that, you know, that we do get some of that manufacturing moving to India. And in this context, I must mention to you, of course, the SCRI. That is the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative, which is there between Japan, Australia, and India. Yeah, and that is a very important initiative also, where we're looking at what can we do to somehow be not only diversify, but, you know, our over dependence on one particular country,
on critical minerals.
Exactly, critical minerals and so on, to diversify. And I think that is something which is very, very interesting, and we need more such kind of, you know, initiatives with other countries of the region.
Absolutely. So values-based trusted networks and supply chains is the buzzword, and India's Act East policy is very much geared towards attaining those objectives. Viewers, it's not just economics. Act East policy, as Ambassador Wadhwa mentioned, has a strong security dimension. India has started playing a bigger role in as a net provider of security in the region, across the Bay of Bengal and all the way up to the Straits of Malacca and beyond. And we are doing lots of interesting partnerships with countries to ensure that it is a rules-based order. India has a vision for what we now call the Indo-Pacific, and the Act East policy is serving our larger vision for the Indo-Pacific. Few years ago, Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke at the Shangri-La Dialogue, mentioning our key vision for security in this region. Let's listen in and continue.
3, we believe that our common prosperity and security require us to evolve through dialogue, a common rule-based order for the region, and it must equally apply to all individually as well as to the global commons. Such an order must believe in sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as equality of all nations, irrespective of size and strength. These rules and norms should be based on the consent of all, not on the power of the few. This must be based on faith in dialogue and not dependence on force. It also means that when nations make international commitments, they must uphold them. This is the foundation of India's faith in multilateralism and regionalism and of our principal commitment to rule of law. Therefore, we should all have equal access as a right under international law to the use of common spaces on the sea and in the air. That would require freedom of navigation, unimpeded commerce, and peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law. When we all agree to live by that code, our sea lanes will be pathways to prosperity and corridors of peace.
You as the Prime Minister of India laying out India's vision for the Indo-Pacific with a special focus on the East Asian region, and Ambassador Wadhwa, equality of all irrespective of size and power. I mean, that's a very idealistic vision laid out by Prime Minister, but we are also doing lots of practical things in terms of defense diplomacy and cooperation with lots of countries in the region. We have the Quad coalition, but also with ASEAN. Now we have upgraded to a defense ministers level dialogue with the whole of ASEAN. We are planning joint maritime exercise with all the 10 ASEAN countries together, individually with key ASEAN countries like Indonesia, Vietnam. We are strong with Australia and Japan. Of course, we are doing many things bilaterally as well as in trilateral formats. There is France that has come in now. There is France, Australia, India trilateral. There is Australia, Indonesia, India trilateral. We are also doing all these interesting combinations now to bring together some kind of a balance of power and some kind of stable order in the region, which has been threatened by Chinese expansionism and aggression. And I think Prime Minister was clearly referring to the fact that, you know, there are even international tribunal rulings against China, but it's not upholding them and is violating international law in its push for hegemony. So in that kind of a context, India, the expectations from India from the region is that we will come in and play a bigger role and take on more of a responsibility. So how do you think is the defense and the security side of Act East policy going?
Well, I think it's, as I said, the strategic element that was added when we started looking at the Act East policy. And also, we've just heard Prime Minister talk about our, our vision for the free and open Indo-Pacific. That was a very, very important and seminal speech that he gave. Those were really principles that were set out. And then you have increasing institutionalization of how do you have the principles and how do you operationalize them? How do you carry out, sort of how is the cooperation really done on the ground kind of thing? Of course, you're talking about the security aspects. To begin with, I do not think, and I think the Government of India has been very careful to say that whether it is the Quad or the Indo-Pacific, the FOIP as we talk, it's not really a security kind of grouping of any sort.
It's not a military alliance.
It is not.
It's not an
all.
Asian NATO.
Not at all. Not at all. It's been very important for us to make that difference. Having said that, anyway, because of several reasons. One is that this entire area has become so important to the global economy and certainly to the economy of our region, because it is really the hub of economic activity. If you look today, very large part of global GDP is generated here. We are part of that region. In fact, when Prime Minister Abiy named it the Indo-Pacific and moved away from the Asia-Pacific, he was including us in the remit of this very dynamic region. Number two, we are located extremely strategically because we are there, at the northern part of the Indian Ocean where all these trade routes pass, and it's so important actually for all the countries that we are there and that we have a blue water navy, particularly for our partners, that, we have a very important role to play. And so what we are seeing increasingly is certainly that we have, for example, we have signed logistics agreements with most of the countries, I mean, a lot of countries, of course, the US, Australia, South Korea, Japan, Singapore. you mentioned it, that we have naval exercises with a lot of individual countries. We talk about security in trilateral, in bilateral, trilateral, plurilateral formats, and saying what can we do together. There's another thing about India. You see, India, first of all, a blue water navy, which means that beyond our immediate needs, that we are able to project power.
Yes.
That is the most important thing. The second thing is that I think that we've already been involved in exercises such as, the anti-piracy exercises. We've very often been the first responder when there have been
Humanitarian
disasters in the region. And
Yeah.
so HADR has become a very important thing as far as we are concerned. Plus these agreements that we have, the logistics agreements. So we are certainly a major player. We are we have signed a lot of defense agreements of different kinds. And with Japan itself, it's about, defense equipment, the development of the purchase and development of defense equipment. I was very surprised to find even with South Korea, as a matter of fact.
And with the Philippines, we are now selling
Exactly.
BrahMos missiles. The Vietnamese are supposed to be in line as well.
Exactly. So I think we have capabilities. We are willing to project the capabilities. But what I think we shouldn't see it is only within the prism of the assertiveness of China and, its sort of lack of will to abide by international law, have a rule-based order. So I think we should not look at it only from that point of view. Certainly is a very, very important element which I think everybody feels threatened by, both the economic and the military assertiveness. But beyond that, this is a region we belong to. We are a major pole in a multipolar order that is emerging, and therefore we have a legitimate right to be here and to deepen our security relations with all the countries in the region.
Absolutely. So viewers, Ambassador Deepa Gopalan Wadhwa telling us that, we often say India has a positive agenda through its Act East policy, is not just to counterbalance China. That's a very crude way of looking at things. Actually, the needs of the entire region are at stake. The prosperity of the whole region is at stake, and of course balance of power is important, and we are also playing a role. We are more alert to realpolitik questions in the Modi era than we were in earlier times. So we are also playing geopolitics, but more importantly, it's the collective fate of billions of people who live in this region, and this is of course the economic heart of Asia, where there's a lot of activity and dynamism, and that needs to be preserved, and we have to make sure it doesn't break down. So I want to thank Ambassador Deepa Wadhwa for sharing valuable insights and sparing time for us today. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for being with us.
Pleasure's been mine. Thank you
viewers,
very
do
much.
think about the Act East policy in all its dimensions, connectivity, economic and security. This is the future. Bay of Bengal and further east is where India's future lies. This is the area where we need to grow, and we need to have a bigger presence and greater influence, and that is the whole purpose of the Act East policy. As Dr. Jaishankar has mentioned, it's a kind of a re-globalization of India, starts with ASEAN and beyond, and the fact that we were cut off from these regions due to colonial rule and the other global divisions, now we have a chance in the 21st century to make up for that, and that's what we're trying to do. So thank you for watching Indian Diplomacy. As always, I'll be back with you next time with another episode. Until then, take care.